Welcome everybody to this KDIGO ISN webinar, which is featuring the outcomes of the KDIGO Controversies Conference on home dialysis, which was held in a rather protracted manner with several virtual meetings during the time of COVID, with the final meetings taking place in May 21. Following this, a paper is being written and it will soon be finalized for publication. So what we're going to be discussing, as shown in this diagram, are the factors that need to be considered when trying to expand or contemplate a home dialysis program. And these are the healthcare system factors, the clinical and facility factors, and then the individual factors. And these are going to be addressed by the co-chairs of the KDIGO Controversies Conference, who are Jeff Perl, who is a nephrologist in Toronto, and my colleague, Martin Wilkie, who's a nephrologist in Sheffield, in the UK. So I'm going to allow now Jeff to take over and start telling us about the various factors from his viewpoint that are important for developing home dialysis.
Thanks very much, Edwina, and it's really an honor to present today. And I want to thank KDIGO and the ISN for hosting the webinar and for hosting the Controversies Conference. These are my disclosures, but probably first and foremost, I want to disclose that I am a firm believer that if someone can do home dialysis, that they should strongly consider home dialysis. And on behalf of myself and Martin, who were the co-chairs of the conference, recall that this is a controversies conference. We're not going to necessarily have all the solutions, and certainly they're going to be very locally based, depending on the local circumstances. But the goal of the conference was to discuss controversies, outline them, and develop some strategies and some future research for implementation and a better understanding of all the factors that impact home dialysis. And I want to point out that the KDIGO website has some great resources. I want to thank our steering committee who provided some invaluable input, of which Edwina was also a member. And I want to point out that the recording of the plenary presentations are available on the KDIGO website, and a much more detailed exploration of some of the factors we're going to touch on today. So for your reference. So I just want to point out that when it comes to dialysis therapy, our patients have a number of treatment options. And these are really, in 2023, I think, the different treatment options that our patients have. And of course, we're going to be focusing on barriers to home-based PD and home hemodialysis today. And why are we even talking about increasing the use of home dialysis? Well, we know that home dialysis certainly increases our patients' treatment options. And we certainly want patients to have as many options as possible. That certainly could impact their quality of life and survival in a positive way and other outcomes. Home dialysis improves patient autonomy by being a participant in their own care. There may be some improvement in clinical outcomes. And historically, in many countries, there's been an underutilization, with the default really being center-based hemodialysis. And in many regions, there's a lack of access to home dialysis. To this day, many countries don't have access and consistently to home hemodialysis. And is home dialysis, particularly PD, a solution to help improving universal access to kidney replacement therapy, and also a solution to some of the rising dialysis-related costs? So I think this is the real impetus to study this question. And, I think embarking on this Controversies Conference in the pandemic, I never really thought about this as an advantage to home dialysis, but certainly data from my province in Ontario, Canada, demonstrated, at least early on in the pandemic, less COVID-related hospitalization and morbidity in our home population. So the fundamental question rising as a result of the pandemic is, could home dialysis as a treatment strategy and increasing its use leave our patients more resilient to the effects of a future pandemic? Rather than congregating in center-based dialysis facilities for treatments, which carry their own risks. So the other justification, I think, are the outcomes on home dialysis. And ideally, if we wanted to look at the ideal way to study outcomes between one therapy versus another, of course, the gold standard is a randomized controlled trial. And in this study from Corrivar in Europe, they really attempted to randomize patients to PD versus hemo. But when you do so, you really remove choice from patient decision-making. And when they educated patients about their treatment option, only 38 patients of the 1,200 that were screened were really willing to relinquish choice and be randomized to one therapy versus another. So I think this cements the idea that patients really do want a very large stake and should have a large stake in the modality decision-making process. And it's very difficult, if not almost impossible, in many cases, to randomize patients to one modality over another, just because of the significant lifestyle implications. And so if we look at a recent randomized control trial from China, in fact, they did embark on this, and this was a pretty large feat. And in the one randomized trial I think we have that was completed, randomizing patients to center-based hemo versus PD, there was really no difference in health-related quality of life, with their primary outcome being burden of kidney disease. And so I think that, again, from a patient-reported outcome perspective, that we don't see any large major signals, at least in this study in China. And that one may question how generalizable this is to other parts of the world. So for the most part, we rely on apples to orange comparisons. Patients who choose one therapy over another are very different than from each other. Patients who choose center-based dialysis may have a different profile of characteristics, or may choose it for various reasons, and there may be a lot of confounding. And so we have to adjust for that in observational data, match potentially by patient characteristics that are similar between therapies, and restrict comparisons to a very valid cohort. And at the end of the day, when we look at observational studies comparing survival across modalities, it's still not a perfect comparison despite these statistical techniques. And there's always residual confounding in observational data. Having said that, no matter the country we've looked at this question in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand, in the US, across Europe, we don't see significant differences in survival between patients treated with center-based hemo and PD. Again, I think this is a justification for increasing the use of PD with no harm on outcomes. Rob Quinn, who delivered one of the plenaries at the KDIGO session, took it one step further and said, well, of course there's confounding. We start hemodialysis in sicker, more acute patients. And when we restrict comparisons to patients who started dialysis as outpatients, again, any early survival differences disappear. So again, in an outpatient elective PD start versus an HD start, we don't see large differences in survival, particularly early on. When you restrict the cohort to patients eligible for one therapy versus another, again, this is a study done in Ontario, among patients who were eligible for both therapies, no strong differences in survival between PD and hemodialysis, and only a third of patients were viewed as ineligible for PD. The next set of analyses on the block are comparing PD and home hemo. In this Australia-New Zealand study, again, huge dramatic differences in survival between home hemo and PD, with superior survival in home hemo. Is it the therapy or the type of patients that are gravitating to the therapy, who tend to be younger with fewer comorbidities? And so that's something that I think really begs to be answered, and we really won't have the answer, but a lot of confounding here. In the United States, when PD versus home hemo survival was looked at, interestingly, there was effect modification by dialysis vintage. In patients who'd been on dialysis for a long time, there seemed to be a survival advantage of home hemo. Again, that doesn't remove the issue of residual confounding, but in patients who had less than 6 months of dialysis vintage, there was no difference in survival. And perhaps early on, PD, which we know is superior at preserving residual kidney function, might have a survival advantage, particularly early on. And certainly in the low vintage patients, no difference in survival. When a meta-analysis was embarked to pool all the observational studies that have compared quality of life between PD and hemo, no major differences between PD and hemo in terms of some of the domains of quality of life. I will say that PD patients consistently report better patient satisfaction with their care compared to patients receiving in-center hemodialysis. So I think we should convince ourselves that There's no strong differences in survival in observational studies. Selection bias plays a key role, and we're dealing with two different groups of patients. But as far as I think we know, there's really no major differences, and it's time to focus on other important endpoints perhaps like life participation, which the Song Group has focused on as a core outcome for PD, and other more important metrics to patients, and we should move beyond survival. So I really agree with this editorial. We should start to move on from these analyses that are flawed by confounding. And again, I think that they have been done to death, and we should be focusing on other endpoints. So now shifting gears to how and why the distribution of home dialysis differs across the world. I'm just showing you Canada, for example, where I'm from, in the United States, where I'll be showing some data as well. Huge differences across countries in the use of home dialysis. And one has to ask the question, what is the difference in the policies, in the practices, and in the overall culture across different regions that drive some of this difference in utilization? And I think we have to think about the healthcare system factors and factors at the clinic and facility level, and Martin will focus on patient level factors. So as far as the healthcare system, we know that there's maybe a drive to increase the use of home dialysis because of consistent data, particularly in developed countries and in high income countries, that the costs of home dialysis can be delivered at significantly lower costs than center-based dialysis. So there may be an economic drive to increase utilization. In the low-income countries, which have been challenged by access to dialysis in general, PD can be established, albeit with less infrastructure, and can be mobilized quite quickly, as we've seen with very successful PD programs for acute kidney injury treatment. And there is a rising use in PD in low and middle income countries, and particularly a rising use of APD. And I think that this speaks to the ability to mobilize PD in some countries that may lack some of the infrastructure for center-based dialysis. But of course, economics do drive decisions, and the costs of PD versus HD are not uniformly the same across all countries. In some countries, PD is more expensive. In some countries, PD and hemo are similar in costs. And in other countries, hemodialysis is more expensive than PD. So one might imagine that the economic drivers to grow PD would be determined on the relative cost benefits of treating a greater proportion of the dialysis patient population with PD. And we do see somewhat of a relationship between the prevalence of PD and the relative costs of hemo versus PD across these countries. So there is no doubt that the relative costs do drive the utilization of peritoneal dialysis. In the United States, which started to bundle dialysis care in the ESRD PPS, where bundled care was all of a sudden implemented, where no matter what therapy a patient was treated on, they received a fixed cost for patients receiving PD versus center-based dialysis. And of course, if PD could be delivered at lower costs, there were potential cost savings to be had. And that did have a strong impact in the US on an increase in home dialysis. And the US has been seeing an increase in the use of home dialysis since 2011. And I think a lot of that is being driven by some differences in policies that have favored reimbursement for home dialysis. So there is no doubt that economic drivers may determine home dialysis use. At the provider level, it may be at the patient level and what our costs are being covered, at the nephrologist level, and at the funder level. So the economic drivers are strong across different domains and do impact the use of home dialysis across several environments. A new change in the United States was the executive order, which proposed that 80% of new patients would receive either home dialysis or transplantation by 2025. And an incentivized payment model called the ETC was launched, where more patients receiving home therapy stand to benefit in terms of an incentivized payment. And in the first year, at least, or the early period of this intervention, this paper, hot off the presses in the last month or two, has shown that there really hasn't been an impact in the areas that were randomized to incentivize payments on the use of home dialysis. Now, this is early days. This happened during a pandemic. And of course, this happened in an environment where home dialysis was increasing in both groups. So I think we can't conclude that these incentives don't have an impact. I think we have to wait until the entire experience has had a more mature period for a re-examination. Another paper hot off the presses, really looking at how delivery of care impacts the use of home, was a study in the United States looking at nephrologists who owned dialysis facilities, and it clearly had an incentive within that facility versus nephrologists that were treating patients in a facility that they weren't owners of. And interestingly, there was a 2.4% increase in the use of home dialysis where nephrologists were part facility owners. And I think this is quite controversial and interesting data, but it does suggest that economic models of care delivery do impact home dialysis utilization. Other factors, I'm just showing you here, for example, this is Toronto, here I am right now. We have relatively fewer center dialysis clinics per square kilometer or square mile than, say, countries in the US, where you can see there's many outpatient in-center dialysis clinics. And you remove the benefit of home, which is not having to travel to the clinic if patients have ready access to center-based dialysis through a multitude of satellite clinics. I sort of call this the McDonaldization of dialysis. The availability of dialysis center-based is quite convenient for patients. And we do know that the farther that patients do live from a clinic that provides center-based dialysis, the more likely they are to use a home therapy. So again, one has to look at each country. If there's been an explosion of satellite-based center dialysis clinics, does that impact incentives for patients to consider home dialysis and home dialysis utilization? A main controversy at the conference was, should we have home dialysis first policies? Should we mandate as a country, does a country have a right to mandate that all patients starting dialysis should be treated with a home therapy, particularly PD? And we know that such policies have existed in countries like Hong Kong, in regions within Mexico, and more recently had been implemented in Thailand. And the idea that we, as nephrology care practitioners, are dealing with a very scarce resource and can only treat a limited number of patients was something that is very historically tied to how dialysis started. And in the United States, you know, it's hard to believe that there was a death committee that allocated who got dialysis and who didn't, with exceptionally stringent criteria we would find very morally challenging to implement today, nor should we. And, you know, it's amazing how far we've come to be able to improve access to dialysis. But in many countries today, even still, there's limited access to kidney replacement therapy. And the question is, if we can treat a larger number of patients with home dialysis compared to the same cost to treat a smaller number of patients with center-based dialysis, is that a justification for PD first policies to improve access to dialysis for all? So at the extreme, you know, countries have a home dialysis first policy, a mandate, and I think that that's been very successful in countries like Hong Kong and Thailand has been able to increase the use of dialysis therapy for patients. And at the extreme, there's countries in which home dialysis isn't available. And in between, I think there's countries that have implemented policies that are home dialysis preferred, incentives, financial structures that certainly create preferences for home dialysis. And I think a lot of how countries do decide are based on some of the policies within those countries, the relative therapy costs, which we talked about, how it's reimbursed. Is it justified by outcomes that are similar between the two therapies within those countries? And of course, if you don't have dialysis and you're struggling with making dialysis available to the population, certainly you're going to consider how to treat the largest number of patients with a maintenance dialysis modality as a consideration in whether a PD first policy is implemented. But of course, there is no doubt that when PD first policies are implemented at either ends of the spectrum, if home dialysis is the predominant therapy or there is no home dialysis, we've removed choice from the equation. And again, these policies do strive to improve access to dialysis, but may come at a cost of limiting choice. And so that's something that I think we have to take into consideration in the context of one of the downsides or concerns about having home dialysis or PD first policies. But it has been successful, no doubt, in growing home dialysis. And again, you can see with an expanding ESRD population in Thailand, they've been able to meet the need with a PD first policy. So just like, you know, in downtown busy centers, you can limit all traffic downtown and not allow cars to come in the downtown core. That might be a home dialysis first policy, a public transportation first policy, or you can create tariffs or levies for cars that enter the downtown area that might disincentivize traffic in a downtown busy core. And I would say those are akin to the home dialysis preferred policies. Not necessarily that it's being mandated, but we create policies, we create economic incentives that seem to make home dialysis a preferred strategy. And I think that's been the approach that has been taken in many countries such as Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and other countries that have been successful in increasing the use of home dialysis without necessarily having home dialysis first policies. So at the clinic and facility level, we know even within the same healthcare system, we know that there's differences in regions in the utilization of home dialysis. In Canada, in the UK, in the United States, in many countries, we know that there are regional differences in the proportion of patients treated within a home therapy. So we do know that there's certainly local clinic or facility factors that are at play. This is data from my own backyard, and I do believe that one of the big drivers for home dialysis utilization is having a champion at a center. Having champions like Dr. Barkman, Dr. Blake, and Dr. Chan, who are advocates for home therapy, does impact the utilization of home therapies at specific centers. And I think that that's something that we need to think about. And of course, if you're not comfortable with a therapy, you may not offer the therapy. And this was some data generated by Jenny Shen, which interviewed medical directors of hemodialysis clinics and PD clinics, and consistently, the hemodialysis medical director viewed many more concerns about using PD in certain patient populations compared to PD medical directors. So, of course, eligibility, I think, is related to knowledge and comfort. And certainly we see a wide range of differences in perceived eligibility for home therapies that I hope can be overcome with education. And we have a long ways to go with education. This is some data from the United States, which surveyed fellows leaving nephrology training, asking them what they felt they needed more instruction in. And the top two factors were home hemo and PD. So fellows are graduating nephrology training programs not adequately being prepared to manage patients on home dialysis. And I have no doubt that that will impact their comfort level with offering and educating patients about home therapies. If you're not comfortable with something, you may not be as likely to offer it. So this is a big challenge. Even to this day, this was some data that was generated with a survey of nephrology fellowship programs in the US. And certainly there's a large variability within fellowship programs in terms of resources for training for home dialysis. And this was just presented at this year's ASN meeting. And we have a long ways to go to make sure that we standardize and develop curriculums and appropriate training for our future nephrologists across all countries. One other thing that I think Martin will also touch upon is home care assistance. When you provide assistance in the home to patients that have barriers for home dialysis, that certainly does increase the utilization. This is data from my own area in Ontario, Canada, where having nurses come into the home to help patients with their exchanges did increase the use of PD. Unfortunately, Dr. Pierratis, who is a pioneer in home hemodialysis, passed away this week. In similar programs, he was really instrumental in pioneering for staff-assisted home hemodialysis, really expanding upon this concept to the home hemodialysis population to improve eligibility for home hemotherapy. How we deliver assisted PD varies across the world, and not one model fits all. And I think we need to understand that locally, the way in which assisted PD is delivered is going to be different. And there's going to be many factors that we take into account. And of course, there's no one size fits all. And certainly you can see here an excerpt from a chart that will be published in our conference paper, very different models of delivery of assisted PD. I want to point out that at a clinic level, it's also going to be the impact of resources. If you don't have access to advanced laparoscopic catheter insertion and best practices for PD access creation, you're going to limit a population of patients that might be eligible for PD. This is one of my patients who was declined PD at 3 programs before coming to see us, and our surgeon had the skills necessary to be able to overcome this. So of course, not only is it education at the facility level, but it's also the availability of additional resources that can help support PD access creation, which I think is a very important point when we talk about PD. So this is a really interesting paper. In Canada, they randomized clinics, 55 CKD clinics, to a multifaceted intervention for CKD patients to improve home dialysis use. So half the clinics got routine care. The other half of the clinics got randomized to an audit or feedback around how they're using home dialysis, standardizing education, having in-person visits, and ongoing education about home dialysis. And interestingly, in this paper, the centers that were randomized to these interventions had no difference in the rate of utilization in home dialysis compared to the clinics that were randomized to routine care. So should we see this as a failure of these interventions, auditing or feedbacking to the clinic, standardizing education? I don't think so. And I think one of the things that we have to think about is how accountable did these centers feel? And how were they able to really modify and develop the education to that particular program and develop a personalized approach? So I think we have to take a step back and say, maybe there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We not only need to look at the intervention, but what are the accountability of the centers for implementing the intervention? How do we know the intervention is being readily accepted by the clinic and the clinic patients are positively receiving that education? So again, this is something that I think we still need to look at. And we wrote an editorial to this paper saying, is there an ideal recipe to increase home dialysis use? And the answer is, of course, no. And, you know, Julia Child, for example, was one of the greatest chefs of all time and mastered the art of French cooking. And her beef bourguignon recipe is, of course, bar none, one of the best. But again, if I took that recipe and tried to implement it at home, it would depend on the local ingredients I have. Am I following the recipe? Am I using the right cookware? Am I catering it to the palate of the population that I'm serving? And I think we have to think about the fact that those interventions really need to be personalized and localized to particular clinics and facilities and environments. And I'm going to stop here, and I hope I've given you some food for thought, no pun intended. And we'll turn it over to Martin to talk a little bit more about the patient-related factors that were discussed in the conference.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a great talk covering both the policy level factors and the facility level factors. I'm now going to talk a little bit more about the factors at the individual level that we discussed during the controversies meeting. So just to summarize again, this is the considerations that came from this controversies conference, this KDIGO Controversies Conference on home dialysis therapies. And by controversies, we mean that we tried to identify where the challenges lay and consider them and find consensus where consensus was, and then present those themes that are uncertain. Those are my disclosures. So just looking at the schema that Jeff had shown, which we're presenting in the paper, I'm dealing with these individual factors down here, and I'm going to look at some of these components here, particularly around education, also approaches to barriers, and so on. So just looking at our abstract, we've said that the clinical outcomes across dialysis modalities are largely similar, and Jeff made that point. Although advantages may exist for one modality over another for an individual for a particular reason. But given that broad similarity, then modalities are preference sensitive and should be based on individual life goals, quality of life, clinical characteristics, and those kind of factors. So we should not be mandating one modality or another, but we should be involving patients and their care partners and their healthcare teams in this concept of shared decision making, where we work collaboratively to enable that decision. And to achieve that, we require, at the center of this work, we require high quality education, both for healthcare professionals, for patients, and for healthcare partners. And Jeff's already alluded to some of the challenges that there are in that area. And of course, everyone who faces dialysis should have access to home therapy. So what about shared decision making? Well, I've just taken a line from the paper that we're preparing. For individuals who are reviewed in chronic kidney disease clinics, recurrent evaluation, iterative education, and preparedness are important, governed by these principles of shared decision-making. So as we considered this, we were conscious of the work that Peter Blake and colleagues had published in Peritoneal Dialysis International back in 2013. And that's demonstrated on the left of this slide, where there's a systematic approach to considering potential people who are candidates for peritoneal dialysis. And the structures behind this program are to think of a quality improvement pathway that gives the best opportunity for an individual to be at home on dialysis. Here we're talking about PD, but this could equally apply for home hemodialysis. So one needs to be consider all potential eligible candidates to make sure that they're assessed for eligibility and then enable that decision-making, place the catheter and start the therapy. But at the same time, the key thing is that we're providing that education in the right sort of way. And here we're conscious of the 3-talk model. And the 3-talk model isn't, ubiquitous, it's not essential, but what it points us to is the need to present the information in an iterative fashion. In other words, to talk specifically about kidney disease and its implications, to talk specifically about the modality options that are available and enable people to look at their preferences alongside their life choices, and then also then to spend some time thinking about that decision. So it's by breaking those up that one can give a better opportunity for people to take on information and to make their decision. And as we considered the work for this Controversies Conference, we wanted to collide both that iterative quality improvement pathway with that mechanism for providing shared decision-making and put it together. And we've done so in the paper. And here you can see that we've put together a schema which will be published in that paper. And it starts again with the different points in that pathway, but this time it's thinking about the educational components as we work our way through that educational pathway. For example, making sure that education is provided at each point, that the decision is brought at the key requirement, that education continues after the individual goes home, being conscious of the cross-cutting themes, such as the need to provide continuous engagement with the patient if that timeline is extended. Equally, if that timeline is very much curtailed, as you might see in an individual who presents late requiring dialysis, that there's also a mechanism in place which can provide education and support for that individual to enable decision-making. So that's one of the key outputs from this conference, I think, is trying to bring together the pathways for shared decision-making alongside the iterative quality improvement pathways that enable that pathway onto home dialysis. And we mentioned peer support being really key. And here I take a picture from the Birmingham, in the UK, Birmingham, UK peer support program, the ACE program, Jyoti Bahraini and Neerja Jain. And people from minority ethnic groups in the UK are underrepresented among those at home on dialysis, people from South Asian communities. And through using South Asian peer support workers, they were able to increase the access to home dialysis for that portion of the population. And what this is telling us is that we need to tailor our programs to reach out to the different groups that our populations make up, and also think about how we structure our educational approaches to give those individuals a chance to have the information that they need to make a high quality decision. So education should be iterative, culturally sensitive, and consistent. That's another very important point. Patients bring up the challenge that they have when they're receiving inconsistent information from different members of the team, and we need to work together to make sure that we give consistent information. This is a slide about learning styles that I've taken from the ISPD guideline on patient training. And I think it's really valuable because it just stops us in our tracks, and it helps us to consider that patients have got different learning styles, from the visual to the oral to the kinesthetic and the read-write. So different learning styles require different approaches, but also different educational needs require different approaches, such as, for example, people who have language challenges, people who have health literacy challenges, for example. And we've put in the document the need to co-produce educational materials with patient partners. And the value in doing that is that we're producing material which people can understand and that speaks a language that they can understand. And that's so important. So what about contraindications? Well, there are very few. We put in the document that really the only contraindication to peritoneal dialysis is the absence of a peritoneal membrane. Of course, there are some relative contraindications. The absence of a home would be one, for example. But broadly, for many people, home dialysis is accessible. This is Matt Oliver's paper from 12 years ago or so, looking at barriers. And the reason why I put it there is because it draws our attention to both physical and cognitive barriers that people face. And on the next slide, I've brought in one of the images from the paper that we're submitting. And the reason why this image is so important is because it considers the environment and what we can do to enable that individual to be able to have home dialysis through considering their environment, through considering how we can meet head on some of the challenges that individuals face through support, through adaptation, through thinking about the occupational therapy which is necessary, and also, I'll come to this in a moment, providing assistance where necessary. So I think another key message from this Controversies Conference is how do we respond to the needs of the individual and consider the adaptations and the requirements necessary to make home the right place for them to conduct their dialysis. And a number of those features are listed there on that, from the technological, thinking about remote monitoring, for example, to the environment, the dedicated space, recent data from PDOPS about pets, the need to keep pets out of the dialysis space, for example, and support, whether that's care partners, whether that's through peer support or formal assistance. And I just wanted to draw attention to this paper, which is really relevant. And it talks about the meaning of empowerment in people on home dialysis from Amanda Baumgart. It's a qualitative evaluation. And it really looks at those domains which are necessary to really enable empowerment at home. So as we think about barriers, what we should be thinking about doing actually is thinking, how can we make the treatment as adaptive as possible and as supportive as possible to enable that person to be empowered on the therapy. So such things as making sure the therapy is as flexible as possible so that it's not overburdening, that we give clear information, that we find ways of overcoming barriers, and so on. So there's a whole range of features there to consider. And this is a slide that Jeff showed, prepared by Edwina Brown and colleagues as part of the group, thinking about models of assisted dialysis. And of course, for us, we're very lucky in the UK. We have commissioned assisted peritoneal dialysis. The model varies across the world, from family members through paid nurses at home, a range of models. But clearly, there are a range of benefits here, from providing an apprenticeship to people as they go home so that they gain confidence with time, to enabling those who are more frail to be able to have a home therapy rather than coming in center, to responding to changes in circumstances where an individual's carer, for example, becomes unwell. There are so many different aspects to this that we've learned about, and we can see it as really valuable. But there's another thing to consider here, and that comes down to this question about support, the ongoing component of home dialysis and this issue of burnout. And I think we need to meet this head on. You know, if we send people home to dialyze, we need to be ensuring that we're thinking about mechanisms to provide respite and support. What can we do to enable that? And in this wonderful qualitative study by Corinne Manera, you can see on the left-hand side the burden. That's the unrelenting responsibility of requiring dialysis. And on the right-hand side, the solutions, adapting and building resilience through support from family, from the teams, the care teams, faith, hope, and finding meaning in a range of other activities. So there's a lot we can do to support and enable and empower our patients in the home environment. So what about educating healthcare professionals? And Jeff's alluded to that also. And in the document, we've said all healthcare professionals involved in caring for persons with kidney disease should receive early and comprehensive core training in all kidney replacement therapy options, including home dialysis. And that is absolutely essential. And here we are today at our UK PD Academy, the full contribution of the multidisciplinary team contributing to staff education. And I can testify from today's work at our academy that bringing nurses and doctors together for group discussions where we share the challenges and learn from each other is absolutely essential to come up with pragmatic solutions to enable people to be at home on dialysis. So education is at the heart of this. Moving on, I just want to say that in the document, we also spent some time considering what research priorities there should be. And I've listed some of them here. These are the ones around modality, education, and decision-making. More work needs to be done to evaluate the shared decision-making process. How does it work in different environments? What's the best way to do that? More emphasis on the need for education programs, as I've alluded to. Then work to be considered on models of training people at home, the best way to do that, whether that can be done remotely or in a hybrid way. And indeed, there's considerable interest in virtual reality, for example, which may really enhance training models. We also need to think about how we assess patient motivation through patient activation measures and how to impact on that, and also how best to use peer support. So there are a whole range of challenges ahead for us to take up in order to come up with some more answers around the best way to deliver home care. So with that, I want to come to our conclusion from the paper, and that is our consensus conference reaffirmed the need for advocacy and efforts to ensure equitable access for all individuals in need of kidney replacement therapy to home dialysis. The place of choice and education, absolutely critical. We say clearly no one-size-fits-all model, and Jeff alluded to that. Context is everything. The local factors are very important, and clinicians on the ground, healthcare teams on the ground need to work with local healthcare delivery systems and political influencers using patient voice as well in order to adapt their circumstances so that it best enables people to have a home therapy. And clinical studies comparing modalities are limited in their generalizability. However, the existing information suggests that both modalities, both home-based and center-based, are sufficiently similar for us to say that people should be able to be given a supported choice for these options. So with that, I would like to draw to a close. I want to thank you for listening, and I'll stop the share and we can open up for questions. So thank you very much. Edwina, back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Martin and Simon, for two really excellent and
Jeff.
So
It's all right.
it's been a long day.
I'm honored, Edwina, I'm honored nonetheless.
Very good. So I see that we've got a huge number of participants watching, over 160, so that's excellent. Can you please put your questions into the Q&A box? And meanwhile, while waiting for people to do that, we did have some questions sent in to us. And the one that I really like, and I'm going to ask first, is if you could only choose one policy to implement, what would it be? And if you could only change one economic driver, what would it be? So I'm going to ask you first, Jeff, what your main choices would be.
Yeah, well, that's a really tough one. And I think what Martin and I said is that one policy would really depend on where I live and how accessible dialysis is. And I personally am of the opinion, and let's take some lower middle income countries that currently don't have access to maintenance dialysis, and patients die who are in need of dialysis that don't receive it. If a PD first policy can treat more patients with end-stage kidney disease and have more access to dialysis, then I'm supportive in the sense that I think that that policy may very well be a life-saving policy for patients in that country. So I would say, of course, that has to be answered in the context of where we practice, but I would love to see the ability to treat a larger population of patients with dialysis therapy and any policy that helps achieve that. So that'd be my first answer. The second question was around economic drivers. I think that incentives financially to grow home dialysis are interesting. And I think that they certainly need to be evaluated locally in terms of how they do drive the increase in home dialysis utilization, whether they're at the patient or the patient who's receiving treatment level, at the provider level, at the clinic level, or at the nephrologist level. But I really am disappointed to see in some cases where there's financial incentives not to treat patients with home dialysis. So I would say in circumstances where those exist, I think that those barriers need to be addressed. And so from a financial perspective, I would hate to see somebody not offered and treated with home therapy because of financial disincentives that we need to address regionally.
And Martin?
Yeah, great, thank you. So I would agree with Jeff. A couple of things that I think the point that he made about financial disincentives. So, you know, where PD turns out to be more expensive because of, for example, import tariffs or components that can be adjusted in that country, I think that's a really important thing to address. It's very hard to get people on a home therapy if it's more expensive to do that. But in terms of the sort of policy factors that make the difference, I think of the pathway onto the therapy. The top for me is education. Not only education for patients, but healthcare professionals, but also for communities, raising the level of understanding about kidney disease and its impact and the possible solutions. So I think education provides the way. I also think that for many parts of the world, having access to percutaneous catheter insertion probably makes a difference too, because that's responsive and in the hands of the nephrologist. So there are a whole range of answers to that question, Edwina, but I've just hazarded one or two there.
And thank you. And questions are now beginning to come through. So there's a really good question here about the role of the multi-professional team in terms of assessing and educating people requiring dialysis about home. And this comment comes from a renal social worker who suggests that anybody who wants a home treatment should have a home visit, and that how successful this is at really getting people to think about dialysis at home and overcoming their sort of sense of security that actually hospital may be better than at home. Personally, I fully agree with that statement. In something in the UK that we cannot achieve. We are not blessed with renal social workers in every unit, or access to renal social workers, or even arrange home visits for every single person about to start on dialysis. Jeff or Martin, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd be happy to pick that up for a moment. Just from my experience today in our breakouts here with clinical teams, you know, the value of the multidisciplinary team is so important because it brings different perspectives, and it certainly neutralizes some of those prejudices that are held by individual clinicians. You know, we can't have situations where sort of a view by one individual can adversely affect someone's chance of being home. And I think that if they have a chance to talk to the team and get that team view, there's a much better chance that they get they get a more comprehensive perspective, if you like. So I think the multidisciplinary team is so important there.
So there's a question here about the US, and I suspect, Jeff, you're going to be able to answer that better than Martin or myself. And that is, what are your thoughts about in the US dropout rates from PD? I mean, we talk a lot about getting people onto PD, but actually maintaining people on PD or home dialysis is just as important. And in the US, they're seeing drop-off rates of over 50% during their second year on PD.
Yeah.
So that's really addressing the standards of the way that we deliver home dialysis as important drivers for maintaining people on dialysis at home.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the attendee that maintaining people on home dialysis and avoiding what I would call premature transitions that are potentially modifiable are certainly a really important topic. We had to narrow the scope of this Controversies Conference to initiation, but KDIGO, if you're listening, I think that focusing on helping to maintain patients on PD, evidence-based strategies, and developing again, a controversies conference on that would certainly fill more than enough information. So I absolutely agree that's an important piece of the puzzle. Through the PDOP study, we had a paper published in CJASN led by Mark Lambie. And Mark did a really elegant analysis of our PDOPS data with our group, looking at factors that impact time on therapy, and it is a global problem. It is a PD-related infections are a global problem. It's not just an issue in the US. And we certainly need to continue to generate evidence addressing infection, addressing burnout that certainly impacts our patients and impacts time on home dialysis across the board. So it is an important topic that we certainly need to continue to develop and understand.
And Martin, I'm sure you'd agree with me that being able to control your infection rates, access to infection, incremental prescribing, flexible prescribing, access to assistance, and really thinking of people's well-being would help people stay on dialysis at home.
Absolutely agree. And we have the resources within us to think about the different headlines which result in early transition off the therapy. And as Edwina's alluded to them, those are the mechanical, their infection, their solute, their water, their burnout, largely. And we have strategies for all of those. And it's how we systematically pull those together in a quality improvement way in order to give people the opportunity to stay on the therapy longer. So that's work to be done. There's very good guidance out there on those topics, and I think it comes down to how we apply those in terms of our practice patterns.
Okay, and there's a couple of questions, I suspect, from different countries about the conflict or the tension between having private dialysis, financial interests, which really means occupying chairs on dialysis units, and therefore disincentives for people to go home. And this is true in the US. Everybody thinks that this is always a US problem, but it also happens in many European countries, many Asian, across the world, that there is this conflict. So Jeff, how do you think that we should address this?
Yeah, I think I certainly have seen different financial incentives and that do disincentivize the use of home dialysis. I think we need to certainly develop and look at what are the factors that are driving them and continue to work on locally trying to develop and implement local solutions. I certainly don't have all the answers. We certainly have identified it as a challenge, but I suspect the solutions will come locally. But as was asked in the first question, what do I see or my top things to work on? I think that certainly is very much high up there.
Yeah, I mean, the models are different, aren't they? There you have a home with therapy with the patient doing it for themselves, and you compare that with a therapy which is sort of, you can easily count, and it's a sort of an interaction with a delivery of an event. And so they're so totally different, and that's the challenge. And that the center-based hemodialysis lends itself to that financial model much more easily. And we have to find mechanisms of countering that in order to enable people to be at home. And I think, countries have given great thought to that. You can see the different ways that that's been done, from the PD first policies that Jeff alluded to, all the way through to the sort of more quality improvement-based mechanisms that have been used, for example, in Canada and in Scandinavia and so on, and the financial adjustments that have been made in the United States. There are a range of different tools there that can be used to adjust that dynamic. And I think, if a particular country thinks, well, yeah, we can see the value in having people at home, adjustments have got to be made to the health policy systems to enable that, I would say.
Okay, I mean, there is a question about the ethics of PD first policies, but I feel that you actually addressed that quite well, Jeff, in your talk.
Yeah,
so
and
I
typed an answer as well.
Okay, so I'm going to come up to the transition from people from PD to home hemodialysis, which I think is a really important one. You know, people who want a home treatment, but yet either can't be on PD or have failed on PD, had a peritonitis or whatever, and become anuric and not getting enough PD, and thinking they need hemo, but they want to do this at home. So perhaps, I mean, I know in Toronto there's been quite a lot of work and thought about that particular pathway. So if I let you answer that first, and then I'll hand the floor over to Martin.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we've designed in our model of care within our program that I think has been very successful is we are a home dialysis program at St. Michael's Hospital, for example. We are agnostic to PD versus home hemo. There are benefits, there's advantages, there's disadvantages to each. And our patients come to our home dialysis program understanding that they may start with PD, but do get exposed to an entire clinical team that manages both patients and touts the benefits. So I think under one care team with a group of multidisciplinary professionals that are able to provide and develop both, we've developed an almost comfort level and expectation from the start that we provide both therapies within our center. And we've published on the fact that that's been very successful in identifying, for example, a patient on PD who might benefit from a transition to home hemo. So I do think that one care environment is really important. The other thing, and there's been a lot of press about this recently with some articles in the New York Times touting the issue, is we've got to level the playing field of simplicity between the two therapies, and the two therapies should be viewed as complementary. So there certainly are, even today, technological barriers that need to be addressed in terms of transitioning patients from PD to home hemo, making it as simple as possible for patients to be able to do home hemo. Also, we need to address fears of cannulation, which certainly is an ongoing barrier to greater use of home dialysis, home hemo. So I think what I see that's really important is education from the outset around PD should not be in-center hemodialysis bashing, because those patients may eventually end up on in-center hemodialysis. We have to educate patients about the benefits for the therapy at that time, and also educating them as part of an ESRD life plan that this might be their first therapy, but there may be other home therapies to consider in the future. So it's all about education from the get-go about both the same care team and addressing technological barriers.
I would absolutely concur, Jeff, and I would add to that if our approach is to teach and enable people to take a greater role in their own care wherever they are, I mean, for in-center HD, we enable them to learn aspects of their own care, then we give people the potential to be more autonomous and make greater choices about being able to look after themselves. So I think it's our approach to, respecting autonomy and supporting people to learn aspects of their own care so that they feel they can do it, rather than disarming them by saying, you just sit there and I'll do it for you. Do you see what I mean?
So I think a lot of questions have now been answered. Somebody has raised the issue of costs of electricity, heating and water, which is obviously going to be really important with the current financial pressures. And certainly in the UK, we are addressing the issues. There's a lot of pressure on different hospitals to refund people for their electrical costs for being on dialysis at home. So it's now 6 o'clock, well, in London anyway, in the UK. We've had a really good hour of discussing the results of the Controversies Conference. Again, I would like to thank KDIGO for giving us the opportunity not only of having the Home Dialysis Controversies Conference, but also of writing and publishing the paper and having this webinar. And I look forward to the final paper being published, which I gather is hopefully going to be quite soon.
Yes, and so we've had some pandemic disruptions. I want to just ask everybody, I'm sure Martin, it feels the same, and Edwina, feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may have that we haven't had the opportunity to answer. And please feel free to use social media. There's been some activity right now on Twitter around the Controversies Conference. So always a great platform with the hashtag #AskRenal to be able to submit all your questions and generate discussions and answers, not only from Martin, Edwina, and myself, but the entire kidney community. So just a plug for that.
You'll see that the lights are going out, I'm afraid, but that's only because I've not moved around enough in this room. But I'll just sit
I thought you were
here
telling us that the webinar is over, Martin.
I have to jump up and run around, and I think I probably won't do that now. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for listening. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for hosting. Great.
And thanks to Eugenie at ISN for doing all the technical work to support the webinar.
Great. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Take care now. Bye. Bye.